Hello and greetings from Baltimore, Maryland, the home of the Peabody Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. My name is Abra Bush, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Institute Studies at Peabody. I'm absolutely delighted you could join us today for our special edition Lunch and Learn session, Leading with Science, returning to music instruction and performance in the time of COVID-19. Before we get started, I would like to thank 4 Peabody staff members who are joining us today and supporting this event. Adam Scalici from Peabody's production team will be in the background monitoring the webinar and working through any technical challenges we may have. If there are any concerns, please put them into the chat and the comments will go directly to Adam. Patrick Wallen from the Dean's Office, Christina Mansior and Zane Forshee from Peabody's Launchpad will provide additional support and help me curate your questions. A very special thank you to all of them. A few quick notes before we begin. This session will last for 75 minutes or from noon Eastern Time until 1:15 p.m. We've curated the questions that you have submitted when you registered and plan to address as many of them as possible. There were a lot of them. In addition, if you have specific questions during the session, please place them into the Q&A area of the webinar. We will do our best to answer as many of them as time permits. Should you have any technical difficulties again, Adam will be monitoring the chat to help you. The presenters have agreed to permit us to record this webinar. The session will be posted to Peabody's Keep Teaching website within 1 to 2 business days, should you wish to refer to it again or share it. I'm very, very pleased to welcome our panelists today. They are among the many persons who have been assisting the Peabody Institute as we prepare to reopen in a hybrid modality this fall. Dr. Stephen Gange is Executive Vice Provost of Johns Hopkins University and Professor of Epidemiology. Jonathan Links is Vice Provost and Chief Risk Officer and Professor of Environmental Health and Engineering at Johns Hopkins. And finally, Aaron Milstone is Professor of Pediatrics with a specialty in infectious diseases and a Johns Hopkins Health System Hospital epidemiologist. Their full biographies may be found on the Peabody Keep Teaching website. So, gentlemen, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I would love to start with you just telling us a little bit, a couple of sentences about your background and how you have helped support Peabody in the reopening. John, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So my background is actually medical physics. Most of my research is in crisis and risk management. I am co-leading the university's response to COVID, and in that role am working very closely with Peabody in terms of their fall operating posture.
Thank you. Stephen, you're next on my screen.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Abra said, I'm in the Department of Epidemiology. I'm actually a statistician by training. I have been with John and others helping to lead university efforts around our COVID response as well as fall planning, including chairing the academic planning continuity work group that constitutes all of the academic bodies across Johns Hopkins in helping them put their plans together for the fall and for the future. I should also mention I'm also the parent of a student who goes to a conservatory overseas, and I'm highly both interested and excited about the substance of this webinar today.
Thank you. And Dr. Milstone.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for joining us. I am a pediatrician. I think my role is best described. For the last 6 months, I've been helping operationalize the Johns Hopkins Medicine COVID response throughout our health system. And as plans started for university reopening, our group was asked to help consult on the lessons we learned through the clinical operations and how those lessons could help inform the academic operations. And that's how we've gotten involved with the Peabody Institute. It's been very interesting application.
So maybe let's start there. What are the things that you've been able to apply from the clinical setting, Aaron, to Peabody, and how has that impacted the planning that you have been helping us with?
Sure. So many of our lessons from the health system are similar in that our primary goal is risk mitigation, right? We're just like the school is trying to provide educational opportunity and experience for students. We're trying to provide access to care for patients at the same time that we're protecting our staff. So common goals, just different populations. So we look at it as a balance. How do we, we recognize that we don't live in a world of zero risk. So our primary goal is risk mitigation. How do we limit risk? And I think or at least I have come at this process with the perspective of mitigating risk in any way we can. We have learned lots about how the virus is spread. I am keenly aware, as are my colleagues here, and I'm sure many of you on this webinar, that there are many things we still do not know about this virus. We have some observations about transmission dynamics, but there are still questions that remain. So we're trying to incorporate our knowledge from the health system side to say, how can we limit risk to students as well as faculty?
Thank you very much. John, I've heard you speak many times about the primary ways to mitigate COVID-19. Do you maybe want to give us a little bit of information there?
Sure. So first of all, I want to echo something Aaron just said. Compared to 6 months ago, we know a ton about COVID. That's a relative statement. In absolute terms, there's still a ton we don't know. And anything we discuss with you today should be provisoed by humility, if you will, in terms of what we do and don't know. So bearing that in mind, the way we are approaching what Aaron calls risk mitigation is 4 basic pillars of public health control measures: masking, distancing, hygiene, and room ventilation. So we say masking because it's quicker than saying cloth face coverings, but what we're really talking about in most situations is cloth face coverings of exactly the type described by CDC. As our conversation with you unfolds, you may hear about N95s or other more advanced personal protective equipment in certain settings, but the baseline is cloth face coverings. In terms of distancing, the magic 6-foot rule is where we start, but I'm sure you'll hear is not at all where we end. And I'm sure we'll talk more about droplets versus other aerosols, and we'll be able to explain our thinking there, but the 6-foot distance is the minimum for us. In terms of hygiene, we're talking about a combination of personal hygiene, hand washing, etc., as well as room and building hygiene. So surface contamination and the transfer to someone from hand to face. And then finally, room ventilation in terms of air exchange, in terms of air filtration, to address some of the smaller aerosols for which the magic 6-foot rule does not apply.
Fantastic. So as we go through this session today, we are going to really dive into all 4 of those significant areas: masking, distancing, hand hygiene, and hygiene in general, and ventilation as well. Those are really where the bulk of the questions that were submitted in advance came from. And again, we'll continue to monitor the Q&A as all of you have additional questions. Dr. Milstone, can you maybe tell us a little bit about what's going on with masking in the clinical setting and how some of that applies to reopening or not? And then maybe John and Stephen, what is happening across our university in terms of masking? And can you then talk a little bit about masking for musicians and some of the challenges there?
Sure. Within our health system, we, like many places for months now, have required universal masking. Primarily, we're using surgical or procedural masks for care of patients that don't have COVID or symptoms of COVID. And for patients that do have symptoms of COVID, we would use an airborne respirator, either a fit-tested N95 mask or purified air, like a PAPR device, or something similar that provides more airborne protection against the aerosols that John mentioned. We also are allowing cloth masks in some public spaces within the health system. So if you're walking through the halls of the hospital, cloth masks are acceptable. We see patients and visitors, well, rare visitors with exceptions, but patients who will come in wearing cloth masks for clinic. Some have the masks you get online that have the little exhalation valves on them. We see all kinds of masks. We've been very aware of what benefit masks truly provide, and we try to message that very carefully. I mean, the goal of a mask is really to catch respiratory droplets. So I always say if I had to walk into a room, I'd much rather everyone else have a mask on than me have a mask on, because the mask is really protecting you from everyone else. Protecting everyone else from you. It's not really doing the opposite. So the goal of the mask is if someone is pre-symptomatic or is one of those rare asymptomatic people, the mask is catching those droplets, those large and small droplets that they may produce when they talk loudly, cough, sneeze, etc. So that's the goal of masks. So we are encouraging mask use uniformly. When we get into situations where people are in closer contact, especially in clinical settings, if you're examining a patient or if you're performing a procedure, in addition to mask use, we are recommending some sort of eye protection, mostly with plastic face shields that you've seen probably on social media or in the news. It's important, I always say, to think backwards of what we're doing with those masks in a clinical setting, which is really to protect the provider, such that if you are around someone who is sick, and this is something to be thinking about, and I've talked to obviously our university leadership about, what will happen to your staff if someone is identified as having COVID? So if a student is identified as having COVID, think backwards. Who are going to be the people that are exposed and meet the CDC's case definition of exposure that will then be told they have to go home and quarantine for 2 weeks? So that current case definition is within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes. So if you're within that person's space, then you put yourself at greater risk. And that's where additional protection beyond just a cloth mask may be important, like a face shield. So that's how we're thinking about the use of masks. So masks worn universally will protect people from coughing and directly contaminating other people or directly contaminating the environment they're in. When they're even physically distanced, that will be of value. Once people are getting closer, additional measures may be needed to protect people from possible exposure that then may lead them to have a risk of infection and or being quarantined if someone does turn out to have the infection.
Fantastic. Thank you for that explanation. Stephen, how is that then being applied to the university writ large?
So we've adopted a similar stance of a expectation that if you are on campus, that you will be using a similar cloth face covering. And that applies both in buildings as well as outside buildings, partly for the protection that it actually provides, partly for, quite frankly, just as a reminder of the importance of this, because if we were to make exceptions, our concern is providing exceptions starts to lead to a longer list of exceptions. And this is one of our basic tools for addressing the concerns of our community, as well as built on a pillar of public health. And it really, just to emphasize, is there because the uncertainty of who's infected is high. I think many people have heard about testing. We might talk about testing in a little bit. Testing tries to provide better information, but as Aaron indicated, there are people who are pre-symptomatic, who have an ability to transmit the virus before they have symptoms, and some people who will never show symptoms. And so it's really important to ensure that you have this base public health measure in place universally that you can build upon with other pillars.
Thank you very much. John, you've been working with us a lot on very specific situations for masking, particularly around wind and brass instruments, singers, dancers, different kinds of masks that are available. You know, there was a little bit of reference of N95 masks versus cloth masks. Could you speak a little bit about some of the challenges that those of us in the performing arts and in music are facing with masking, and what steps you know, are out there to help mitigate some of those?
So first of all of us are incredibly sympathetic of all of the challenges throughout the university where we're trying to figure out a safe operating posture. I would say Peabody is at the top of the hit parade. And so we feel for you, you know, and we're with you. I want to start by emphasizing something Aaron said. Masking in general, I think there's a lot of confusion around. Frankly, I think there's a lot of confusion around everything having to do with COVID in the media. And we'll probably talk about other areas of confusion, but let's talk about masking now. Aaron made a very important distinction that I want to emphasize. So in a healthcare setting, when a healthcare provider is wearing a mask, it's called personal protective equipment, PPE. That is to say, the primary purpose of that mask is to protect the wearer. In the case of a cloth face covering in a more general population setting, the main purpose of the cloth face covering is to protect everyone else from the wearer. That is an incredibly important distinction. And so the distinction is not simply one of how good a mask is it. It's really a distinction of primary intent. And so I want to start there. So what that actually means is, in a non-healthcare setting, when a singer or a wind instrument musician takes off their mask in order to perform, the primary question is not then, what can we do to protect them? Because they weren't wearing that face covering to protect them. So the primary question is, what can we do to protect everyone else? And so the ways we can protect everyone else are things like the musician or singer is in a room by themselves, and there's a low latency feed to one or more additional rooms with accompanists, instructors, etc. Another is, well, we better have more distance to compensate. Another is, we better have more air exchange and ventilation in the room. Now, we amongst ourselves have very lively discussions about the relative importance of those four pillars I talked about: masking, distancing, hygiene, and ventilation. None of us think they're equally important. And so none of us think it's sort of a simple substitution, and if I cut one in half, I double another, and that sort of thing. Distancing, honestly, is the most powerful tool. Face coverings, hygiene, room ventilation is a bit of a wild card. When we first started talking with Abra and her colleagues at Peabody, said, "Can't you just do everything outside at with everyone sort of distanced from each other?" It's like a double whammy. But there is no formula for this. It is flat out as much art as it is science. But what we're trying to do is create an ensemble of control measures that together are reducing the risk to a residual level of risk that we find acceptable. And as Aaron said at the outset, that's not zero risk, but we don't live our lives on a daily basis outside of COVID with zero risk. And so, you know, there are situations where a face covering can't be used. But honestly, when we first started talking with Peabody, we thought, gosh, it's like a dancer can't possibly have a face covering. Well, yes, they can. And particularly these days with the fancier, more expensive sports face coverings, you know, Under Armour is here in Baltimore. And so we, of course, are wildly enthusiastic about theirs. Just kidding, not a plug. But, you know, we do have samples of their athlete or sports face coverings, and we like them. And so some of the assumptions, so even a singer, it's very hard to play a wind instrument with a face covering, but you can sing with a face covering. You may not be able to instruct as well with a face covering because you're obviously not seeing mouth position and so on. We're actually facing some of the same challenges with lecturing. So I happen to be teaching a course right now. I'm teaching it over Zoom, but I'm using the opportunity to experiment with a series of different face coverings, including some with a clear plastic insert so that students can see my mouth and so on. So getting creative, thinking about the ensemble of control measures in place is the name of the game.
Thank you. That's wonderfully helpful. You started to talk a little bit about distancing. You started to talk a little bit about droplets and those kinds of things. I wonder if one of you might want to tackle the aerosolization and some of the challenges there before then we start to talk really in more depth about distancing and ventilation. I'll leave it up to the three of you.
I'll take a stab. If we were to measure the aerosols or droplets, think of them as water particles coming out of my mouth as I'm speaking to you versus coughing or sneezing or singing, we would see in every single case a distribution of sizes of these water particles, if you will, in air. And if I'm sneezing or coughing, that distribution of sizes would tend towards larger sizes, what are conventionally called droplets. And if I'm simply speaking or if I'm breathing, that size distribution is going to skew towards much smaller particles, which we call aerosols. So the larger ones might be in the 5 to 10 micron range, and the smaller ones might be in the half a micron to a micron or even smaller. When we get below about half a micron, in the context of COVID, it becomes irrelevant because it's too small a water particle to meaningfully carry virus particles. When we're talking about the very large droplets, there could be a whole bunch of virus particles in such a large droplet. And so, of course, the initial focus was on airborne transmission by droplet. The thing about the large droplets is they settle out of the air rapidly and within a relatively short distance just by gravity. And so what I always refer to as the magic 6-foot rule came into being simply because the vast majority of large droplets are going to settle out of the air when someone coughs or sneezes within about 6 feet. Is 10 feet better? Yes. Is 15 feet even better? Yes. Of course, it's the law of diminishing returns. But back to this notion of what if I'm singing, the instructor has to be in the same room. The instructor has to be able to see my mouth, shape, position, etc. Okay, have the instructor 10 or 15 feet away, not 6 feet away. It's just kind of belt and suspenders. Because we've known all along that it's not just large droplets that are emitted, the notion of aerosols that are smaller has been with us since the beginning, but honestly, everyone just glommed onto the large droplets. So it's almost like this new discovery of smaller aerosols and do they pose a risk or not. If you've been following recent media, you know there's a ton of controversy about how much we should care about the smaller aerosols. Our thinking at this point is, let's not argue about whether or not we should care. If we can increase the air exchange, and if we can increase the filtration of any air that recirculates, we're going to do it, just because. Similarly, you know, there's been arguments about how much surface contamination and surface-based transmission matters. And again, our thinking is we're not going to have a scientific answer to that that tells us care a lot, care a little, care not at all. And so we're behaving as though it's important. And I think once you make operational decisions about how you're going to behave, it circumvents a lot of the uncertainty that's going to legitimately be with us for some time to come.
Thank you. The behavior piece is a huge issue, especially for those of us who are dealing with collegiate age students. Stephen, as the father of two young ladies in that age group, how are you recommending that they function in the world, and especially one who's about to hop on an airplane to Europe? What is the advice you're giving them, and what is the advice you would give colleagues too around these issues?
So I think in my mind, helping to make them part of the solution and not being seen as entirely part of the problem, I think is an important aspect of that. We have at the university level a student advisory group that includes everyone from Peabody student, an undergraduate, incoming undergraduate student, all the way up through a MD, PhD student. And I think they are pretty representative of Hopkins students and students in general, who are, quite frankly, very enthusiastic at themselves recognizing that the behavioral issues are critically important and need to be communicated more peer-to-peer than in any other fashion that might come across as pejorative, right? And we've seen this, you know, over the years with other types of behavioral modification, other type of preventive efforts of ensuring that you have buy-in from the community. So my first, you know, and part of what we're doing at Johns Hopkins is to ensure that we have clarity of our messaging, right? What do we want students to do, right? You know, you hear a lot, you know, we're all flooded with various information. So I would certainly encourage, you know, everyone who's struggling with this with ensuring that you have some key messages. And I think both Aaron and John have articulated at the university level what we see as key messages that are important for ensuring the health of our community. Then it's a matter of reinforcing those messages on a continuous basis. We actually have at Johns Hopkins, we're working on a campaign in which it will, we're working with people who do health communication for a living, of ensuring that the messaging that we put out to students and other parts of the community are consistent and reinforced. And then we're working with our student partners to try to find those opportunities to intervene. You know, the ideas of prevention are huge here. So how can we set up our environment and ensure that we have a clear prevention strategy? Part of that is providing the right materials to all of our students. So health kits that include face coverings, that include a thermometer, and other guidance on what the key messages are. Having a way for students to check their symptoms on a regular basis with, I should say, have an expectation that they will do so, right? It's certainly not natural, and it will certainly take time, but you know, we're looking into ways to enhance that kind of behavioral adaptation, whether it's through an app, whether it's through other access that, you know, that they would need in order to, again, reinforce the need that this is a basic component of what we're doing. So I would say, you know, public health provides, you know, over, you know, a couple hundred years of knowledge of, in some sense, things that have worked and things that haven't. Prevention strategies are an integral part of that, and I would, you know, just highlight not to try to get, in some sense, too fancy. You know, the things that we're talking about are basic measures, and they do help.
Thank you. I think particularly with issues like masking and distancing, right, and hand hygiene, those are very clear ways in which we can all help each other in mitigating this. And so I wanted to make sure that we emphasize that primarily. These are very simple steps for all of us to take.
Right. Good for COVID, good for influenza, good for a lot of things.
Right, right. John, I want to turn back to you in this issue of aerosols. And we've been working a lot, of course, on air exchanges and ventilation. In addition to, so I would love for you to talk a little bit about those things. But then in addition to that, I've noted on social media and even in the questions that were posed to this group before this session, there were a lot of questions about plexiglass barriers and even the possibility of singing in plexiglass face shields, or again, just specific kinds of shielding and masking that I think I know what you're going to say, but I'd love to hear you and talk about that in terms of what we're planning on the university side. And Erin, if you want to chime in at some point on what goes on in clinical settings, I think that would also be very interesting for those of us on the call.
So let's start with plexiglass barriers. You all haven't heard us mention plexiglass barriers yet. That's kind of a hint. We don't honestly see much of a role for plexiglass barriers. If you have a cloth face covering on, and if the distancing is being observed, which parenthetically in some retail settings, the distancing isn't observed. So if I were a grocery store checkout person or a post office checkout person, I would be very happy about the plexiglass barrier. I'd be wearing a mask, and I'd be happy about the plexiglass barrier. But if cloth face covering is being appropriately worn, and if distancing is being observed, we don't think it adds anything. Now to face shields. So Erin is about to tell you that in a healthcare setting, a face shield at times is a very important complement to a mask in terms of protecting the wearer. What I'm going to tell you is a face shield is not a substitute for a cloth face covering in terms of protecting everyone else. Two very distinct settings and purposes for the face shield. And so we have considered and discarded the notion of a face shield as a substitute for a cloth face covering or mask. We are absolutely not against a face shield as a complement to it, but it's not a substitute for it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Again, there have even been Q&A questions today on that topic. I have seen some beautiful barriers being erected in people's studios and in office places that are kind of tall and kind of push a singer into a corner almost, but that are open on the top or open on the bottom. Can you explain some of the challenges of plexiglass and why that's not been a recommendation that you all have made for us?
So if you think again about a size range of water particles being emitted, those that are very large, were you to sneeze or cough, and if you were just wearing a face shield or if you had some sort of plexiglass barrier in front of you, those would likely impact on the face shield or the plexiglass barrier. Great, it's better than no face shield or no plexiglass barrier. But lots of the smaller droplets and particles aren't going to impact on those, and they're going to go around the face shield or up and over the plexiglass barrier and so on. And so a minute ago, I indicated there are circumstances in which there's some utility for a plexiglass barrier, but that utility is as an add-on, not as a substitute for.
Great. Thank you so much. John, we're going to stick with you for just another minute. Air exchange. Oh, Aaron, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, I wanted to make a general comment. John's done a really nice job distinguishing aerosols from droplets. I just wanted to make a couple more comments about aerosols. People are getting more and more anxious about the role of aerosols, as John alluded to in the literature, and whether or not they are a big driver of transmission of this virus or a minor driver of transmission of this virus. And I think some of the messaging that has come out initially was that there may not be aerosols. And I think where the science lays now is that there definitely can be, this virus can be aerosolized. And then the question really becomes, how likely is that? And then we're dealing with risk mitigation. If we say it can happen, I mean, our clinical experience is that yes, this likely can aerosolize, but that in many settings, it is very low risk. And you can think about everyday settings that can help explain that or support that. Many people go to the grocery store where someone has had COVID, and not everyone who walks into that open space gets COVID. And if we think of other infectious diseases, viruses that are transmitted primarily by aerosols, chickenpox virus, measles virus. Measles virus, if you, and many of us started to see measles again over the last year and are aware that if you walk into the room of someone who had measles, even if they've been gone for up to 2 hours, those small aerosols can still remain in the air and you're at risk of getting infected from just being in that same airspace. If aerosols are a primary driver of COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we would likely see a very different pattern of transmission. Most people who have COVID have a clear exposure, not unknown exposures. And we know from a healthcare setting, for example, many hospitals are still using plain surgical masks with eye protection as the personal protective equipment to prevent exposure to the virus. And as John said, if this was in the aerosol, if this were aerosols, that aerosol would go right around the face shield into the eyes, or even around the surgical mask, which doesn't protect you from aerosols, and infect more healthcare workers. So I think we all think that yes, and I think this has become a messaging thing, and we need to be very clear with COVID about, again, as we said right from the start, what we do and don't know. I think we do all suspect that the virus can be transmitted through aerosols, but based on the science that we've seen, it is probably not the likely transmission pattern. It's likely driven by droplets. Therefore, there's not going to be zero risk. So I think all the things that John's been mentioning as abatement strategies or mitigation strategies are, how can we limit that unlikely risk that if someone aerosolizes, we are going to protect everyone? And there's not a zero risk environment right now. It's how do we limit that risk? Zero risk environment, everyone stays home, no one goes out of their house, no one interacts at all. But as long as we have people interacting in any environment, it's not zero risk. So how do we reduce that risk? So I just think that's an important clarification.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think helps us pivot into the next thing I would like to talk about. As we all have students coming, or many of us have students coming back to campus in the next few weeks, one of the things we've been talking about a lot, John, are air exchanges and HEPA filters and HVAC in large spaces, large volume rooms like theaters and instrumental rehearsal rooms, but also in tiny practice rooms and dorm rooms and other kinds of small spaces. So again, I'd love to turn to you and ask you to talk to us about what all that means and what we should be looking for within our organizations, our colleges, universities, and performing arts organizations in order to return safely.
So let me start by picking up on what Aaron said. So is it the large droplets we should be most worried about? Is it smaller aerosols? Is it surface contamination? Like, what really should we be worried about and what should we be less worried about? And I'll just tell you our opinion. We're most worried about the large droplets, and we're less worried about the aerosols or surface contamination. That's what we think in our hearts. How are we behaving? We're paying meaningful attention to all of it. And this goes back to what I said earlier. If we want scientific certainty about what we should do, we're going to be sitting on our hands for a really long time. And so, in the meantime, we are informed by science, but the science doesn't have enough certainty to prescribe what we're doing. And so we take the scientific information and we do our best to control all of these possible routes of transmission. So we're not saying, look, you guys, if you have distance, you're basically covered. Don't worry about face coverings. Don't worry about hygiene. Don't worry about air exchange and filtration. We're not saying that to you, and we sure as heck are not ourselves behaving that way. And so I think sometimes the scientific controversy, which is legitimate at this stage of the game, can be an unnecessary distraction. Decide what the responsible sort of precautionary thing to do is and try to build a system that still allows you to accomplish on your mission, and not in some crazy way, but in some operationally possible way, while trying to reduce risk responsibly. That's fundamentally it. So air exchange and room ventilation, that's about the aerosol, right? And it's funny, if I had my choice, I'd rather walk into a huge warehousey space like a Home Depot than into a practice room at any conservatory, because those large spaces tend to have good air exchange, and the volume of air is huge. So these aerosols end up uniformly distributing in the airspace over time. They don't settle out of the air the way larger droplets do. And so that's why people are concerned about, how often am I bringing fresh air in and exchanging fresh outdoor air with the indoor air that may have these aerosols in it. That's what air exchange is about. A low air exchange rate might be 2 air exchanges per hour. A like really nice rate might be 10 or 12 air exchanges per hour. Most rooms in buildings are, in the 4 to 8 range. It's not just about air exchange, it's also about filtration and the rating of the filters. So MERV 13 or 14 is what you're shooting for in terms of the filter's efficiency to filter out small particulate matter in the air that is then being recirculated back into the room, because in most rooms, the air coming in is a mixture of fresh outdoor air and recirculated indoor air. And so the air exchange tells you a bit about how long it takes for most of the air to have been exchanged with, quote, new air. But there, in most rooms, in most commercial buildings, there's a mixture of fresh outdoor air and recirculated, filtered indoor air. And so we're paying attention to the filtration and we're paying attention to the air exchange. Peabody happens to have, Peabody's a pretty old building. It's a super amazing building aesthetically, but in the context of COVID, there are some rooms that are not my favorite rooms in the university in terms of air exchange. And so we're doing local modifications in terms of extra HEPA filtration. Some of those rooms have windows. That's a pretty convenient way to increase air exchange with outdoor fresh air. And so, we're thinking creatively in a belt and suspenders way about room ventilation, air exchange, and filtration. Again, not because we're convinced that these smaller water particles, aerosols, are a super duper meaningful mode of transmission, but simply because it's the responsible thing to do in the face of controversy.
Thank you very much.
John, can I add one thing to that? So that's a great summary. One additional consideration, we have a lot of providers on the healthcare side who say, I want to do my procedure or see a patient in a room that is a negative pressure room. And most negative pressure rooms have 12 to 15 air exchanges per hour. And we remind them that the negative pressure room doesn't add a lot of protection for the person at the time. It's different than being outside on a windy day where the air is quickly getting whisked by you and reducing exposures to droplets and small aerosols. This is how quickly the overall air in that room changes. So I just think it's important for people to contextualize that for your faculty and staff is increasing air exchange from 0 to 2 to 4 to 8 may reduce the likelihood that if there are some small particles that are in the room during that lesson, they will get filtered out more quickly once that lesson ends, or someone who could be contributing to that contaminated space, once that person leaves, it's not going to dramatically have any impact on who's in the room at the time. And that is, I think, a big misconception. People think, oh, if there's a HEPA filter in the room, or if they make the HVAC work better, then if I'm in there, I'll be more protected. It's actually not the case. It really is for the residual after the lesson.
This is a really important point. And one of the other things that we're doing that's a change for us is we'll be running the HVAC system at its new full bore 24/7. Obviously, we normally don't do that in order to save energy. But it's not about magically sucking out the aerosol in the moment. It's about sort of on average over many, many hours and days, the level of aerosol that's in any particular room.
Ultraviolet light has had some press about it and the possibilities that might kill some of the virus either in the air or large droplets on the floor. Where is the science on that right now?
So ultraviolet light is a disinfecting approach. It's used in some healthcare settings. It's used in some other settings. It is a line of sight approach. So if you have contamination that is hidden or shielded, it won't be hit by the ultraviolet light, and thus it'll have no effect. Ultraviolet light has been proposed both for surface contamination and airborne contamination. It's been proposed both as a measure in between room occupancy and during room occupancy. We have looked into ultraviolet light. You have not heard us talk about it, which is kind of a hint at where we personally are with ultraviolet light. So I'm not going to say a bunch of bad things about it. It's simply that we haven't found it a necessary addition.
Yeah, we had a lot of clinical experience with ultraviolet light in the healthcare setting. There are clearly studies showing that if you turn the ultraviolet lights on, they will reduce contamination of the environment. It hasn't been shown that having a good cleaning crew that's going to come in and wipe down high-touch surfaces and clean the environment has any, whether ultraviolet light has any additional benefit at preventing the spread of infectious diseases over basic enhanced. And when we say enhanced, it's really optimizing what people are doing already by cleaning high-touch surfaces. So although it's an appealing option, I think when John went through the 4 pillars, it could fit into one pillar, but it would still be, I think, quite a bit lower on the list of priorities than basic things like having available cleaning supplies, right? Having the available products for things to get wiped down in between use is going to be probably more effective than just trying to institute an expensive intervention that may not have additional benefit.
Thanks. John, there was a question that came up in the Q&A. Could you just restate your preferred air filtration settings or your air exchange settings?
So all else being equal, a higher number is better.
Great.
And 2 air exchanges per hour is a low number. 12 air exchanges per hour is a high number. Most rooms in commercial buildings are in the 4, 6, 8 range. Most of the rooms on our campuses are around 8. There are some rooms that are more like 4. We also, and CDC recommends, beefing up filtration to the extent you haven't already. And the MERV rating is the common way of doing that. And what we're looking for is a 13 or even a 14. Higher number is better.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. I have a bunch of very specific questions about specific instruments and specific challenges with those in terms of distancing, in terms of numbers of minutes between activities. I'm going to just start peppering you with those. And if you can quickly respond based on any of you, based on your knowledge, we'll get through as many of them as we possibly can. All right. I'm going to start with singers because that's my home area. And so just quickly risks to singers and numbers of minutes in between events and what the chief concerns are. I will note for all of you here that our organization, National Association of Teachers of Singing, has done a very good job describing a lot of this. So we'll go quickly through the singers and move on to some of the other instrument groups. Okay, go, singers.
I'll start, and I'll make a general comment that I think applies equally to singers and to wind instruments. I think we're concerned more about larger droplets than smaller aerosols. If I'm shouting, I'm not disproportionately producing smaller aerosols. I'm disproportionately producing larger droplets. And so, distance is your friend. In our work with Peabody, it seems that face coverings are possible in a group singing situation in a way that's much harder in an individual lesson where visualization of the mouth is important. And so distance then becomes your friend if you think it's about the larger droplets. Similarly with wind instruments, it's really control of the droplets. In junior high and high school, I played the trumpet, so I'm quite familiar with very large droplets. And honestly, it's a lot easier to control the very large stuff than the smaller stuff. And so just being smart about it is the name of the game. And so controlling the spread of the large droplets, or if you can't do that, the distancing is the primary mitigation.
So when giving a lesson in a room to, let's say, a trumpet player, how many minutes of rest in between those events should we plan for?
So the notion of the downtime for the room goes back to Aaron's earlier comment about air exchange. What you're really trying to do is clear out many of the aerosols that could have been generated during the session. To my philosophy of, it couldn't hurt, and belt and suspenders and an ensemble of control measures, what we're doing with Peabody is anywhere from a half hour to an hour. Do I think that's better than nothing and meaningfully better than nothing? Yeah. Do I think it's the answer? Absolutely not. The fact of the matter is, if I'm primarily worried about larger droplets, they will have settled out of the air pretty immediately during the session, and the downtime in between isn't going to address them. So if I have an unmasked singer, it's not about having downtime in between singing sessions. It's more about the distancing during the session.
Thank you.
It's also really, go ahead, Stephen.
Sorry, I was just going to add, also remembering that I think what we're generally talking about are people who are not showing symptoms, right? And we would, I think all agree that anyone who has symptoms, which is the highest time when someone may be shedding virus, really should not be in these settings at all. We're talking about mitigation strategies for those who may be in the short window before showing symptoms.
Aaron?
It's a great point. I was gonna add to that, and a number of universities have announced that they may test students as they come back to campus. If that happens, we'll learn a lot more about the prevalence of the infection in asymptomatic 19, 20-year-olds, which will help provide either reassurance or not in this setting. If we know, we can tell you from our data testing, say, patients before surgery who are asymptomatic, the rate of positivity is very low. It's less than 1%, much less than 1%. So the likelihood of someone actually shedding COVID if they're asymptomatic is low. But I do think what John was saying about the turnover, it still comes down to what people's risk tolerance is and anxiety level is. If you want to be pure, then the CDC has a nice little table that says, based on the number of air exchanges, how many minutes does it take to really turn over the air, either at 90% or 99% purity. So you could, if you want to really reduce your risk the greatest, look at that table and come up with a number. What I would really encourage people, and as my application of over the last 6 months of how we've done this have really been very reminding of the importance of talking to the staff. So ideally, I would talk to your faculty who are going to be in that room to get a sense from them as to what their tolerance is going to be. If you have a 70-year-old instrumental teacher or music teacher, they might say, I want that room to sit for an hour because I want as little risk as possible. And others may have a different risk tolerance. So I think engaging the communities to find out how they feel protected is going to be really important as these decisions are made. Because I can tell you that some of our best laid decisions have not implemented well. in the setting of not really learning from our stakeholders first and our who it's getting applied to.
Thanks. That's a great reminder. We really appreciate that. There are a number of additional questions about string players, piano players, other sorts of composition, for example, distancing between faculty and students, and then also whether a room would need to rest in between those events. And I'm curious your recommendations there.
They're all masked. So if they're masked and distanced, that should be fine.
And
I think when we were doing ours, if I remember, the one we were most concerned about was the flute, because the flute was the only instrument we could think where someone can't be masked and isn't blowing into an instrument that might catch some of those droplets, like the trumpet or the horn. Or so I think people have to be thinking of what may happen if someone's blowing their flute out across. They're really that may be a higher risk setting, as John said. Maybe need a greater distance than a brass instrumentalist.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. A lot of questions about choirs. Aaron, I know I spoke with one of your associates about choirs and some of the initial reports coming out of everywhere from Amsterdam to Seattle about choirs as super spreaders. And I wonder if you might comment on that literature, that research at all, or some of the question marks there around choirs. And also we can talk a little bit about what we're planning to do there as well.
Well, choirs present two main challenges. People aren't masked and they're often in close proximity. We've identified super shedder events both in that environment and in other environments. And there likely is a host role in a super shedder that we have yet to understand, why some people are super shedders and other people aren't. But there have been some high profile super shedding events within choirs. So choirs do make me nervous, especially if they can't be done in a setting of masking and appropriate distancing. But again, we're not gonna prevent a singer from generating droplets. If a singer is going to generate some small amount of aerosols, that may also be possible. So it's going to come down to, in my mind, having a covering, the catcher's mask or mitt, and the distance. And as John keeps saying, the distance is your friend. The farther apart you can get people, the better.
Good, thank you. We've not addressed large ensembles, really. We started to with choirs, but large instrumental ensembles also pose quite a risk. You've given us some good guidance around numbers of people we should plan to have in a room and numbers of people we should not plan to have in a room. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about large ensembles, both strings and bands, wind bands, as we start to come back to campus.
So I'll give this a shot. For obvious reasons, I'm more worried about a band with wind instruments than I am about a string ensemble. But let's start with the string ensemble. So one thing we haven't made clear is what our operating posture is going to be in a regular classroom in the fall. And I hope it goes without saying that in a music classroom, you're not going to be more lax than you are in a regular classroom. So the regular classroom becomes the baseline expectation. And our baseline expectation in a lecture type classroom is that everyone, including the instructor, is masked, and everyone, including the instructor, are on a minimum of, in our case, 7.5 foot center to center distance, which accounts for kind of the width of the human being, and then 6 feet on any side of that person of their own personal space. That's the approach. So if I have a large string ensemble, when I walk into that classroom, the spacing ought to be, in our case, at least 7.5 foot musician to musician, and everyone's wearing a mask, including the conductor, if you will, as the equivalent of the lecturer in a conventional classroom. As I then go to wind instruments being present, I certainly do not want those wind instruments sort of intermixed with the other instruments. I want the wind people segregated from the non-wind people, and I want the wind people segregated from each other. And so the arrangement of that ensemble is going to look really strange by conventional standards, but it's just the logical application of the principles and practices we've been talking about.
Thank you very much. There are also questions around disinfecting rooms and sterilizing spaces. There was an interesting question that really sort of touched me from an elementary school teacher in the Q&A about having her children sit on the floor when they come back to campus. I wonder if you could talk about how we keep things clean.
So we are not going to go in between classes and fog the rooms, for example. What we are going to do is pay particular attention to what we call high-touch surfaces, and those will be cleaned multiple times a day. The good news is pretty much any disinfectant seems to be effective, so you don't have to get too fancy. Now, what's a high-touch surface is going to depend on the setting, and I like that the sitting on the floor was just mentioned, because that is conceivably a high-touch surface. So it's going to be particular to each setting as to what constitutes high touch.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, I would add the way kids are going to get COVID, if it's not through droplets, is through touching something in the environment and then touching their mouth and face. And that could happen in the playground or in sports class. It could happen in music class. It could happen in the cafeteria. So that's why this hand washing, I still think hand washing is the primary pillar, because if people stay away from each other and aren't exposed to these droplets, then it's going to be touching a surface and a kid sticking his finger in his nose or rubbing his eyes or eating, which is why reinforcing hand hygiene is so important. The one caveat for instrumental is shared devices. So a piano is a little different, because you could play the piano and then you could wash your hands before the net, or in between, people can wash their hands, just like other shared equipment. I mean, we cannot sterilize everything. So this goal of using sprays and fogs, and it's really diminishing return, because it gets so quickly recontaminated that. So I'm not a huge proponent of that as a primary intervention. Hand hygiene should be the primary intervention. But if you do have shared common instruments that could be touching, and we talked about this earlier, I mean, there may be some environments where brass instruments are shared between students. And that obviously would be a much greater risk than a shared piano. So if this was brought up in one of the earlier questions, if there is some environment where things are being shared, I would either say don't share. Any single use should be the goal, and in the absence of that, if that's not possible, I would say consider not entertaining that activity, and consider pausing that activity. But if for some reason it needs to happen, then very compulsive detail to how that shared equipment would get contaminated in between, like the mouthpiece of of a brass instrument. That should be of utmost importance, because that will be such a clear risk for the spread.
So let me just amplify that for a second. It's a really important point. So if you have a brass instrument, maybe you have to share the instrument, and you need to think about hygiene of the instrument. But sharing of the mouthpiece, a mouthpiece is cheap compared to the rest of the instrument. And rather than thinking you can do adequate hygiene on the mouthpiece, everyone has their own mouthpiece. For a woodwind, we were actually, before this started, we were talking about, woodwinds and sharing of reeds. It's in these times, it's literally inconceivable to us. Do not share a reed, period.
Thanks.
And there was a question in the chat about saliva, and saliva is contagious. So if kids are, or older people are sharing a brass instrument and cleaning out their spit valve that could have someone else's secretions in there, then there needs to be the available, hand hygiene. So as soon as they open that valve and it comes out, they're washing their hands, because that would be a contagious secretion.
Stephen, I want to turn back to you and ask you to speak to some of the folks who are going to be asked to return to campus over the next few weeks. We have a lot of faculty and staff and even students who are actually just afraid to come back. What would you say to them in terms of returning to campus, in terms of staying safe, and also how might they work with their employers, their specific colleges and universities, in order to have those conversations about the challenges they feel like they have?
Sure, and I was looking at the Q&A and seeing some of the questions around that. I think it's important to recognize that CDC has a list on their website of people who are increased risk for severe illness. It is individuals who are older. I think we all have seen that through the media, but it's good to think about a source that documents this. I think the CDC website, we've referred to it a number of times on this call, is a primary resource that people should use for trusted information. There's also a number of medical conditions that CDC recommends that if people have these medical conditions, may have increased precautions that they need to take. So it's important, if you're a member of one of these groups, to take extra precautions. All of the things that we've been talking about today are there to mitigate the risk. I think that, again, all of them are not pointing to any magic drug. We don't have a vaccine yet. It will be a while before we get a vaccine. And in order to, engage with society, unless you're going to truly isolate yourself, you need to take these risks for eliminating or these strategies for eliminating your risk. The individuals who are listed, older adults and with medical conditions, need to take these extra precautions to ensure that they are appropriately preparing and ensuring that they are at lower risk, if at all possible. The way that that we are approaching this at Johns Hopkins is a combination of truly accommodations. Our Office of Institutional Equity is well versed in handling accommodations for students and staff and faculty who have, and we're going by broadly the CDC guidelines. If you have one of these conditions, you are eligible for an accommodation, and the individuals in the Office of Institutional Equity will work with supervisors and others in identifying the right accommodation for someone. We're also using adjustments, which is not using our OIE process, but individuals who may not themselves fit these conditions, individuals who may have someone living in their house who is older or who has one of these conditions. And that would be an opportunity for them. We've put out very, I would say, tried to be as encompassing and transparent as possible, that we believe that we can find individual resolutions for individuals who have increased risk or concerns about others in their household. So that's the way that we're handling that. I recognize that may be very different in different settings, but I think it gives us, you know, a evidence-based approach, you know, using the guidelines from CDC in terms of what they are saying as individuals who are at highest risk, and trying to make, to the extent possible, accommodations and modifications in their work schedule to mitigate those risks. We've made investments, you know, in trying new technologies when possible. So for example, you know, we've talked a lot about the need for an instructor, in some cases, to directly view an instrumentalist or someone else, whether that necessarily has to occur in the same room, whether you can set things up so that, you know, people are physically separated yet connected through technology is, you know, Abra, as you know, one of the strategies that Peabody is using to try to enhance the environment to minimize those interactions.
So just a couple of quick expansions on the important points Stephen made. So when Stephen uses the word accommodations, he means it in the formal ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act sense. So it's a legal term and imposes legal requirements on us in terms of reasonable accommodations. That's the first point. The second is when Stephen refers to the CDC guidelines, there are 3 categories of conditions depending on the level of evidence of that condition makes the person vulnerable to COVID. We're actually using all 3 categories in our accommodations. And then the adjustments is outside of that formal ADA process and allows us the flexibility to make adjustments for others, and we're trying to be as liberal as we can. Having said that, if we didn't believe that the 4 pillars we talked about at the beginning were very meaningful control strategies, we wouldn't, in a moral sense, ourselves open up. And so we actually do believe that this very non-routine operating posture that we've been talking about for the fall puts us at a level of risk equivalent to normal times with much higher density of folk in a room and none of the other control measures.
Gentlemen, thank you. We're out of time. I wanted to know, though, if you could just maybe provide 1 or 2 sentences of advice to all of my colleagues across the world, frankly, as we begin to open back up. So if you would speak to the administrators among this group today, and just any little bits of advice you might have for them. Dr. Milstone, I know you are up against the clock and need to hop on another call. So if you'd like to start first, that would be fantastic.
Sure, and thanks everyone for attending. It's been and thanks to my co-panelists. It's been a great discussion. What I found is probably the most important is transparency about what we do and don't know, and also making sure everyone's very patient and resilient around things that will change. Because even as we know within our institution, the plans we're making today may look very different in 2, 4, and 6 weeks as the epidemiology of the pandemic changes. So I think preparing people for change and uncertainty, although it's very difficult, we all know, is going to be critical.
Thank you. Dr. Links.
I'll piggyback on that a bit. We've been talking a lot about our operating posture in the fall, but that operating posture presumes certain conditions about the pandemic in Baltimore, in Maryland, in surrounding states, and so on. And I think flexibility is the name of the game. If the conditions are worse than would support the operating posture we've been talking about, we need the intellectual honesty and the intestinal fortitude to say, well, we gave that planning our best shot, but the conditions don't warrant it. And we call off everything we just described to you. So I think the combo of flexibility and intestinal fortitude is a high priority requirement in these times.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Gange.
So I agree with both of what my colleagues said. You know, there's a question there about the 4 pillars. we can't emphasize those enough, right? You know, the use of face coverings, the use of distancing, you know, when possible, set up classrooms, set up, you know, all of the environment to enhance that distance. That will help. The use of hygiene and these environmental controls, to the extent possible when they make sense, are all basic strategies, and we can't emphasize how important they are for making the progress that we need to make, both across the world, but also increasingly here in the United States.
Gentlemen, I simply cannot thank all of you enough for your insights and your expertise. You have made a huge impact today in the lives of so many of my colleagues around this country and around this world, and I'm so grateful. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Christina Mancior, Zane Forshee, Patrick Wallen, and Adam Scalici for their support today behind the scenes. As a reminder, these Lunch and Learn sessions are going to continue to occur live every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time through the end of July. A full list of sessions, upcoming presenters, and previous sessions are available on the Peabody Keep Teaching website. Following the session today, a brief survey should pop up in your browser. We look forward to your feedback and recommendations for future sessions, and we hope you'll consider tuning in again. Stay well, wash your hands, socially distance, ensure you have good ventilation, and wear a mask, and enjoy the remainder of your day, everyone. Take care, bye-bye.